I'm not really sure what exactly to call this, a retrospective or review or just a video essay, maybe even analysis, but we'll just call it a retrospective. I put this together primarily for my friend and to give this type of thing a try. Just to preface, though, I need to say that I know next to nothing about music. I have trouble placing genres sometimes, and so there's probably a lot of things that'll go right over my head. Also, I know this is a video about a Pony album, but I'll try to keep the cringe to a minimum and explain some things for potential normies. Although, I'm pretty sure nobody's gonna sit through this without any knowledge or interest in small horses. I'd also like to apologize for the mic quality. I'm just using a Logitech gaming headset. All the way back when I was in middle school, the MLP craze started, and it was my first real exposure to a true fandom on the internet. Looking back, I'm not quite sure what got me invested in the show, whether it was the program itself or the buzz surrounding it, but I think it was the latter. It's really impressive to see the amount of love something this dumb got. Tons of people forming little communities and lots of art, stories, and even music at a level you don't really see anymore when talking about fan content. A lot of these people started to transition these talents they started learning because of a pony show into hobbies they were passionate about and even real careers. You might even say it's where some of them got their cutie marks. Ha. But it's been a decade since then, and the hype's died down. Most people have moved on to other things, but not everyone, apparently. Somehow, this fandom is alive and kicking and still creating new content to this day. Vylet Pony is a musician I started listening to over a decade ago and has been making music ever since. They're one of two of these fandom musicians I've kept listening to over the years, and despite being lay pony cringe, has made music I love listening to this entire time. Ponies may be a stupid thing to stick to after so long, but it shows a lot of passion and refusal to chase trends, which is admirable. One of the major reasons I like Vylet's music so much is because they don't stick to any single genre. Every new release is a surprise, and Vylet uses this to very effectively tell stories with music. Not that it's impossible for a rock band to tell a story with, say, a rock album, but using multiple genres to do it opens up a lot of possibilities. Homeward is an hour and a half long 2019 concept album about horses in space, a sequel to a previous album, but self-contained enough to be enjoyed in a vacuum. The main characters are setting out on a journey across the stars in search of a place to make a new home. Initially, I was going to do this video from the perspective of somebody who doesn't actually know the story, because for the last 4 years I didn't. Then I learned that Vylet made a whole fan fiction paired with the album, and normally I'd go back to my original plan, but it's a merciful 28,000 words, so I figured I might as well give it a go. As to why I chose Homeward specifically to make a video about, I'm not quite sure. None of my favorite songs are on it, though most of them are really solid. Maybe it's just that I really like the Space Odyssey theme. I might have liked to do one of Vylet's other albums, but Fairy Tales is 40 songs, and I don't think I'd have the patience to sit down and make that, and Cutie Marks doesn't leave much up for interpretation. Anyway, the fanfiction is conveniently divided into chapters, named after each of the songs, minus a couple we have to do some guesswork on. I'll be going song to song, and giving the thoughts I have on each of them and how they relate to the main story. I'll also try to provide some perspective as to the way I thought about the narrative before truly reading it. And also, real quick, in case I reference them, the characters are Celestia, Saturn, Twilight, Reyna, self-insert, Silver, and Spectre. I'm not going to be doing anything crazy with this video, it's mostly just going to be me talking, but I'll show each song and its art on screen while I'm talking about it, as well as playing the track quietly in the background. The album begins with a kind of prelude, a simple, folky song. The first half is sung in a made-up language, likely that of the world they're soon leaving behind. Based on the fact that the first half of the song is sung in this potentially ancient language and not the whole thing, I interpreted this as the people of the world singing of their dreams about the stars, and wondering what may be out there, while the second half is an answer to this age-old question. It being in English places us in a more modern time period. We're finally going to find out what secrets lie among the stars as the starship leaves the surface, possibly for the last time. Inside of the story, this is mostly an introductory chapter, setting up world building and whatnot. Songs like this are why I think Vylet is so good at telling these stories through music. You likely already have something in your mind as to what this track is about. I probably don't even need to dive into chapter 2 to extract some context for it, although I will say that it's just a short chapter, mainly for character introductions. Square 1 kicks things off in earnest with an energetic and hopeful tune. It's the beginning of a grand adventure, and the starship, which I pictured as more of a small scout type vehicle, but is apparently home to 10,000 souls, is hurtling through space. The crew's excited and cannot wait for what the future will bring, and like I said, this all comes through in the music. However, if we take a closer look at some of the lyrics, there's something hiding in the cheer. Lines like, "A serpent likes to move on through the rough," are strange considering what snakes typically represent. "Still we're racing through the stars from what?" I actually used to think this said "for what" until I bothered actually reading the lyrics, but understanding it to be "from" significantly changes things. Others like, "We still lie to ourselves," and most obvious, "There's a darker truth," make it clear to anyone paying attention that this spacefaring adventure isn't all it's cracked up to be. I really like Square 1 as a song, and the way it keeps the good vibes of adventure while still laying its cards on the table in the lyrics. The starship is intercepted and landed on an asteroid to determine its makeup and potential system of origin, along with other science-y stuff is what's going on here in Convergence. I'd say this doesn't quite come across here. For years I thought of this as kind of a raising an army song. The powerful energy and beat of the drums certainly make it seem like that. Though I'd say the latter half does a better job at portraying a collection of scientists peacefully doing what they do as time slips by. Honestly, I don't have too much to say about Convergence, other than that I like the first half. It feels like it's building to some kind of action, which I actually think gets a little bit deflated, being followed by strangers. Although, I'm not sure how I'd actually go about fixing that. Very insightful, I know. Strangers is cool because we can and should take it two ways. The first, the way I did initially, is that the people on the starship are all strangers to this new world outside. And the second is that the two characters involved are strangers to each other. Strangers is a piece about fear and uncertainty. Vylet breaks down to Saturn in their room about how they want to be back home, in a home, and explains how, even though they try to be brave, are still scared. Saturn echoes this sentiment, although more stoically. Although the song is melancholic for the most part, the feeling the chorus gives us is more forward-looking and hopeful. It's juxtaposed with lyrics like, "Still the fear I can't contain, my heart still longs for a hope," telling the audience that there is hope, even though our characters may not see it. Before reading through this story, I thought that many of the songs in the album shifted throughout many different places and characters. This is one of the main tracks that contributed to this belief. Coming from Strangers, I wasn't quite sure how we got from melancholic daydreaming to being overwhelmed with bug monsters so quickly. I thought something along the lines of the ship was drifting through space while the main character dreamt of things to come and reflected on how they felt. And at the same time this was going on, we got a shift in perspective to another character elsewhere in the universe dealing with a swarm of changelings. By the way, changelings are bug creatures that can shapeshift, for those who don't know. I figured what the album was doing was building to an eventual meeting of all these disparate characters that we rotate through during the course of the album. Aside from who and when, Vylet makes it pretty easy to deduce what's happening during Swarm. The vocal splice echoing in the beginning gives the impression of an alarm, along with the obvious mimicking of a kind of sci-fi AI warning them of an incoming swarm. Then we're assaulted by scratchy dubstep, which is a pretty good choice of sound for the frantic sprint out of the cave, being chased by innumerable changelings. When the heavy dubstep lets up about a quarter of the way through, we get to hear a beautiful atmospheric piece as the group darts out of the cavern and away from the creatures chasing them. Getting a moment of respite, all is peaceful, and for a minute, Saturn is alone on an asteroid adrift in the vastness of space. The scientists have all retreated back into the ship, and now all guns are trained on the cave entrance. The tail end of the song is, of course, the ensuing battle. Narratively, this song is really awesome and one of my favorites here. The only thing that doesn't really come across in the music is the fact that the reason they ventured into the cave was because they noticed a system of pipes leading back into the walls. The only negative I have to say about this one is that I'm not a huge fan of the scratchy dubstep like this that recurs a few times in the album. If it weren't for the drops in this song, I think it may be my favorite on the album. Even so, they aren't bad, but I've heard the signature Vylet Pony drop so many times at this point, I guess it doesn't really do much for me anymore. I'm not sure how to explain what I mean by that, but it's the bright sounding, higher pitched sound present in a lot of Vylet's music. Another example of it can be heard in Worlds Adrift on the album Mystic Acoustics. Anyway, aside from that, this song is another really atmospheric one. When it's calmed down and we listen to the vocal sections, there's a really cozy vibe, and I wish it persisted for the whole 4 minutes of the song. You get the sense that the room full of characters have been through hardship and came out on the other side best friends who belong together. Unfortunately, though, there's a couple issues with it. I think it sounds a little too sweet for this to be the 6th song in the album. Sure, you can call it an interlude, but in my mind, it sounds like something you'd expect to hear at Journey's End. Lyrically, of course, we know it tells us we aren't through yet, and I really do get the feeling that the song would fit in perfectly as the last song in a story like this. The main issue I have with it is how out of sync with the story it is. Whilst the characters are laughing and interacting with each other, this is a part in the story where we start to have major suspicions about Celestia, who is captaining the ship, and the real intentions behind visiting this place. She seems to be concealing information, and after all, aren't they supposed to be searching for a world to colonize instead of landing on another one of a trillion rocks in space? If it was up to me, I'd try to capture the main characters' interactions with one another more in the lyrics, but underpin it with some sinister sounding notes instead of the somewhat happy ones that we get. And this song, I think, would be a perfect place for this to happen. This is another song that I think works really well when it isn't tied to the fanfiction story of Homeward. I'd go so far as to say it does a poor job of capturing the essence of the chapter. When you hear the song, you probably think the same type of chaos and battle as in Swarm. I definitely did too, and I still prefer to ignore the real context for my own version. The story handles the situation in a kind of light-hearted way. 2 changelings are loose on the ship, hiding and disguising themselves until eventually they're caught. The story that I extracted from the music, however, was that of a total infestation while the ship was in transit. And as the creatures wreaked havoc on the lower decks, the crew prepared to leave the bridge on a mission to destroy them all. As I said, not a big fan of the more dubsteppy sound, but the appearance of another musician, Prince Whatever, is absolutely awesome. It's very aggressive and even more so than their normal music. I really like this part. The music and lyrics are really effective together in getting across the crew's disgust for the changelings, and I feel like we're about to descend into the ship to obliterate them. Again, this isn't really what's supposed to be happening, but if we take the song in a vacuum, I'd say it's really great. Also, I know the enjoyment for the first half of the song is mostly subjective, but I can't help but wish Vylet had chosen another style to capture the chaos in this album. I'd more thoroughly enjoy the album instead of sometimes just waiting for that part to end. Harbor is a song Vylet is listening to for a brief moment whilst singing along. It's given the treatment of being turned into a full song here. While it has no real narrative significance, this song is really good for the album. Instead of needing to try following along with the story, we're given a vignette of life aboard the starship in the form of Americana garage music, which brings to mind images of someone in a repair bay working on their landing ship with a big old wrench or something. Despite being detached from the events of the story, the lyrics describe Vylet's experience on board the starship and brings up their fears like they talked about with Saturn in the line, "In a brave new world, how brave are we?" Harbor is a great way to give us an atmospheric piece, which simply doubles as a fun song. As for how it flows from Danger Close, I'd say there were probably better places to put the song, as really because of the context, this song could go anywhere that you wanted it. Harbor Part 1 fades out and the tape stops. We're back to following the story. Like the first part, this is an atmospheric piece where Vylet starts to get close to Silver. Previously, the two hadn't had much of a chance to connect, and Silver was more of a background character, but here we get to learn about the two of them and their backstories. Sure, Harbor may be a whole chapter, but all you need is right here on the warm and cozy track. I think a music album should stay a music album, but this gives me a glimpse of what can be accomplished by broadening your understanding of what an album really is. But I'm stopped just short of really seeing something in that assessment, as this is only a relatively simple bit of amateur voice acting, and the piece lasts 2 short minutes. Ultimately though, if I put aside my wish to see this as just a song, I'll say that this is a great way of capturing 2 new friends on their space voyage. I know this is becoming a bit of a fanfic rundown, but unfortunately with something so closely intertwined as this, it's unavoidable. Here, Silver helps Vylet and Saturn sneak out of the ship to venture back onto the asteroid. This was discussed by the characters in Elysium, when they began to have suspicions about what's really going on. They come to the door they found before being attacked and swarm, and open it with an acidic compound they were experimenting with in Elysium as well. Are you starting to see why I think the song Elysium has some issues? This is where the opening of the song places us, right at the opening of the doors in the cave. This song is another close favorite of mine. The intro is cool and shares some similarities with the echo and sound of space when Saturn escapes the cave in Swarm. The beat keeps the pressure up as they descend deeper into the cave. What they find is a kind of communications outpost, in their language and all functional, no less. As for the title, Monolith to a Halcyon, we need to understand a little more of the story as a whole. But first, a halcyon is defined as denoting a period of time in the past that was idyllically happy and peaceful. The period in the context of the story was a time before a war, which is actually what a previous album, Mystic Acoustics, is about. The monolith, however, we may have to be a little more metaphorical. A monolith is a kind of monument to something. Literally, the title is saying that the outpost is a monument to a time of peace before the war. But it's not actually a monument, nor is it a big rectangle. The monument is the purpose of the location itself, transmitting data to and from Spectre's cohorts for the purpose of coordinating a rebellion against the current government of the world to return to this time of peace that they dream of. The only gripe that I have with this song is not rhyming running in circles to the break of the stars. You could have used suns, because technically it's still the same. Story-wise, this is a quite significant moment, and the music does well to capture this significance with the energetic and memorable tune punctuated by loud synth. It's easy to listen to the song for the first time and make the correct assumption as to what it's about. Aside from the lyrics flat out telling you, the music works to make sure you understand the significance of it all. I'm a big fan of this song. While I don't like the constant perspective shifts from a story perspective, I think it works in the context of a music album. If we were to listen to Swarm, Cataclysm, Armada, and potentially Danger Close back to back, I think the constant stream of dubstep would disrupt the quality of the album as a whole. Now that I think about it, the dubstep is more indicative of the chaos of combat rather than a changeling theme. Although in most cases changelings are heavily involved in combat. This is what I'd written prior to reading the story, and now that I know the context of what's actually happening, I think the abrupt genre shifts may actually hamper a listener's ability to understand the story from just the album itself, more than I initially thought. This is something that I touched on a little bit previously. The broad narrative strokes of the album and understanding of what's happening within the context of a single song are there, but the issue is the way some tracks connect to each other. Sometimes the change in tone is so abrupt, I wonder how these songs could possibly come after each other. Maybe it's just me, and most listeners understand it's common practice of a concept album to go step by step, but as someone who isn't musically literate, this wasn't quite clear to me. A potential way of alleviating this came to me after I scrutinized the album for this video. I noticed a good number of tracks actually fade into each other, and in some cases, for example Danger Close, if you play the song on its own, you can actually hear the tail end of Elysium before the song begins in earnest. Though I can't really determine for certain whether or not this is supposed to be simply for a pleasant listening experience, or if it's intended to be the type of linking of songs I just mentioned, as a song like Harbor Part 2 simply ends without this transition. Just a fade to quiet, even though Monolith to a Halcyon is a direct continuation. I think songs fading into each other this way might actually be a good way to place songs chronologically, if a little obscure. The solution to this drastic change in tone and even volume, however, seems to be the creation of a slightly more or less mellow song to pad the transition. But anyway, as for the song itself, it's more of the loud chaos. The context of which being that some kind of hostile fleet has found our starship and begun bombarding it and the asteroid. Additionally, we meet a significant character, Spectre, who descends to the surface to confront Saturn before being repelled by heavy gunfire. The bombardment is tearing the asteroid apart as Saturn sprints back to the ship. We of course end up back in the nick of time and engage warp drive to escape. As seems to be the case with most of the action-packed songs, the frantic dubstep does a great job painting a picture of the kind of action happening, highlighting the gunfire and explosions as the asteroid gets closer to obliteration. And as the surface is cracking under our feet, the pace and intensity of the music increases drastically, which I think is really cool, even though it may not be particularly pleasant. Wayward is similar to Harbor in a way. It's more of a vignette which time and place doesn't necessarily matter. It technically takes place a day or so after escaping the asteroid. It's tender, but you can also feel longing in it. As the characters, Twilight and Saturn, apparently have a thing for each other, and for a brief moment they have nothing to worry about as they chat in Twilight's room. But of course, duty calls and Saturn is left to ponder the moment. It's a subdued 2-minute song that does what it's trying to do really well, but once again, I think this one, coming right off Cataclysm, is a little bit too drastic a shift in tone. Norfay is the name of the planet where the starship escaped to and is hiding from the fleet they encountered. It seems to be a desolate Arctic world. Here, Saturn and Vylet contact a tertiary character back home and ask them to investigate a location called Statera, as Saturn seems to believe there's a link between it, the asteroid, and Spectre. This is done behind Celestia's back, as the gang is firmly suspicious of what's being kept from them. I'm not sure what the song is explicitly trying to be. It could be a theme for the world they've landed on, or it's supposed to symbolize the group's thoughts and fears about what's about to be uncovered. Though I think it's likely both. The first half is soft and orchestral sounding, likely meant to evoke the feeling of staring across the vast frozen world so far from home. But the second half we begin to hear more synthetic sounding instruments as Saturn and Vylet contact someone back home. Finally, when they relay the message that they found on the asteroid was addressed to someone named Satellite, Starlight trembles. This is where the music picks up and we hear the creepy breathing sound thing, possibly meant to represent Starlight's fearful gasp. I really love whatever's going on in this part of the song, by the way. It's a weird kind of sound that I've never really heard before that transfers the unease onto the listener. Even though they likely don't know what's going on, they'll realize something disconcerting is happening. Penumbra is a 10-minute multi-part song. It details Starlight's exploration of Statera, a cyberpunk-esque city surrounded by a massive wall and marked with a huge spire building in the center, which lay heavily damaged and likely unsafe to enter or demolish because of an attack Saturn led on the leader years ago. That whole story is part of the Mystic Acoustics album, which, if you're really interested, is a prequel to Homeward. Saturn's performance in this campaign is why they were invited along on the starship. Anyway, the first segment is called Statera, and is essentially a theme for the city as Starlight ventures through. Segment 2, The Violet Nightmare, is the exploration of the interior of the spire, titled so because as Starlight examines some strange runes carved into Satellite's empty throne, they're thrown into a fit of terrible pain and awaken in a void. In segment 3, Hysteria, a ghostly figure begins talking to Starlight. It's Spectre. Segment 4, Starlight's Lament. Spectre taunts Starlight with past misdeeds. It's clear what Spectre's purpose is now, to dethrone the current rulers, Celestia, Luna, and Twilight. Segment 5, The Ardent Crossing. Starlight wakes up from this dream amid the rubble and begins to frantically run through the halls of the spire before coming to a massive door, and enters. Hundreds of changelings lie dead of apparent suicide. Spectre explains that should his subordinate Satellite fall, they were to take their lives. Segment 6, Penumbra, is another back and forth argument between the two as Spectre attempts to pull Starlight away from Celestia's side. Spectre argues that the world is ruled not by truth, but by a blind wish for harmony at any cost. Additionally, Spectre warns Starlight that the princesses will know when all of this is relayed back to Saturn, and the beginning of the end will roll into motion. The last segment, Blood of the Aspect, is an outro played while Starlight passes on all they learned during the trip to Statera to Saturn and the gang. This one's actually pretty difficult for me to analyze in any meaningful way, as it's pretty lockstep with the story and seems meant to be read at practically the same time. What I can say, however, is that Ardent Crossing does an amazing job at rolling out the twofold reveal that not only had hundreds of loyal soldiers killed themselves, but also that they were changelings in a satisfying way. The horn blaring as the doors opened and wind rushed into the room, and climax upon seeing the bodies were all done excellently and paints the picture for us. Also, Penumbra is sung as an argument between Starlight and Spectre, and each character comes through a different headphone, which is a nice touch. As Spectre had said, Celestia had been monitoring communications between Starlight and Saturn, and began planning to fly to another planet, Tyr. This chapter is very short and is simply a quick look on the bridge of the ship, as Celestia reveals not only that they know everything, but also knows who Spectre is. Even during the quiet parts of this song, there's an ever-present wood block ticking away that gives the same effect a clock might in a song like this, but at a higher tempo, reminding us that our time is rapidly flowing away. Also, the lyric, "Never once could you trust an alicorn, all the power in the world is yours to command," is important, but seems to be a statement directly from the storyteller, rather than any character in particular. By the way, alicorns are the horses with wings and horns. In the lore, they're immensely powerful and immortal, and there are also very few of them. It also may be important to know that Spectre is an alicorn as well, though clearly not part of Celestia's cohort. It's possible that this may not just be a statement on the abuse of power by the princesses, but foreshadowing something Spectre may have waiting in the wings. Ha! The song's also an example of the type of transition between songs I mentioned I would like to see more of. Listening to Asphyxiated immediately after Penumbra is not as jarring at all, and going from one to the other is pleasant. It also acts as a buffer between The Armada and Penumbra. It doesn't drop us down to such a subdued level as, say, Wayward, right before going into a much louder song. The Armada doesn't do anything we haven't already seen before. As a matter of fact, it echoes and is structured like Cataclysm almost identically, even down to the much quieter segment before ratcheting back up in intensity. Not only are songs very similar in the way they're portraying the heat of battle, but also the context. We have another battle with changelings, which we know are at Spectre's beck and call now, but also a brief confrontation between Spectre and Saturn before warping away just in the nick of time again. It's actually a bit weird how the two songs are like this, and almost makes me wonder why Vylet Pony didn't at least switch up some of the pacing of this fight. I do, however, prefer the Armada to Cataclysm, and they both have their own merits. The imagery Cataclysm conjures up in the back half of a mad dash to the ship as the ground under your feet shatters to pieces is pretty cool, and the quiet section in the Armada is easily visualized, as the dragon that apparently came from somewhere crashes to the icy ground after getting blasted. Although it's possible that this part could be Saturn and Spectre locking eyes on the battlefield, I prefer the former interpretation. This song's familiar if you've been listening to the music. We hear something very similar in Convergence, but where Convergence sounds like it's being performed from the perspective of the good guys or adventurers, Tears chanting sounds much more sinister and militaristic, especially considering it's in this foreign language we can't understand. This is a weird thing considering the chapter of the same name details events which seem almost whimsical: an arrival on an inhabited planet, complete with talking sea serpent and sages with a prophecy of how these travelers from the sky would deliver them the truth of their existence. But now that I've been thinking on this so long, I'm beginning to believe that this march or chant or whatever you want to call it isn't actually coming from our perspective, and nor was it in Convergence. This is Spectre and his army singing as they chase our characters across the stars. They are the from what in Square One. Vylet Pony is laying their cards on the table now, whereas in Convergence, they didn't want to show their hand so explicitly, and kept it plausible that it could be about us too. I think that what makes it really obvious at this point is the lyrics state, "We will fight for the truth," and we know that this is a driving force for Spectre after what was revealed to Starlight during Penumbra. I'll say that I don't believe the serpent that likes to move on through the rough, also mentioned in Square One, is the talking sea serpent in this chapter. I actually really love this revelation, and I hope it's not too off base. If this is the case, then both Tear and Convergence really are a perspective shift, like I initially envisioned them as, and calls into question whether or not this has happened with other songs. As for how this tracks with the main story of our characters, I say it doesn't really do that at all, but as I said, that's likely the point. Listening to the song with no context, I was actually drawn to the assumption that this is a song about raising an army or the like. So again, if I'm really hitting the nail on the head here, I'd say the song does a fantastic job getting this across. Also, this nullifies a bit of my criticism of Convergence. This song, as well as the next three, do not have their own chapters in the fanfiction, so I'm on my own here to interpret as I will. An Odyssey is a retrospective song about the journey so far. The story of Saturn and the rest comes to a close for now, and leaves us on a bit of a cliffhanger until Fairy Tale's released a year later, which really is one hell of an album. Go give it a listen if you haven't. This song is more in line with where our main characters are at in the end than Tear, and I think this would be a really fantastic song to leave us on, and I think it probably should have been the last on the album as it ties everything up really nicely. Really, I do see it as the last true song on the album proper. We get the signature Vylet Pony drop once again to round things off in a vaguely bittersweet final song. The remainder I picture as bonus material to supplement the story. Only thing that brings this song down a bit is Bien's singing. I think that they've got a pretty good voice to be a voice actor, but for the purposes of the song, it just feels like reaching for a note that they just barely can't hit.
Cascade below, the lights dance before her eyes. She thinks
Dakria is Greek, in case you were wondering. It means tears. I'm not sure exactly why this one doesn't come before an Odyssey, though. Vylet Pony sings of the new world, Tyr, and the prophecy its sages foretold from the storyteller's perspective. This is right where the story leaves off before its final chapter. A world that was shrouded, unknown to the universe till now, touches on the fog and great magic barrier that keeps Tyr safe. And the legend of the three refers to a legend of three heroes who wandered the lands of Tyr in search of Spectre and never returned. This is my favorite song on the album. The song seems pretty simple. A ukulele underlines the song, and overlapping vocals do the rest of the work. The end result is really beautiful, if not a bit melancholic.
find a way to make them understand the world is at your knees.
The final three songs are all one large one on YouTube, much like Penumbra, though the length of Penumbra's segments don't warrant their own individual tracks. They're all sung from Spectre's perspective. We no longer need to refer to the story for Roses, as the lyrics are all pretty explicit in their message, although the final chapter of the story is actually a speech given by Spectre to his army, which is lyricized here. So really the content of this song lines up with the final chapter, not Prince of Sorrow. Spectre sings highly of himself with, "Listen to the wisest of them all," leading us to see him as less than just a misunderstood good guy. And with the next line, Spectre makes it clear to us where he comes from. "I had everything, a crown and a castle, most beautiful of them all, and all my life on the run just to grant you safety." It seems as though his allegiance is with the changelings, and he has lost everything trying to protect them. It also opens up the possibility that he ruled alongside Celestia at some point. We also hear the Super Pony World, that is the overarching story tied together by multiple albums, motif here. Of note in the chapter, however, is something we miss if we're only listening to the music. When Spectre says, "All my life on the run, just to grant you safety," he looks up to a serpent above him, but no other description is given. This is likely the serpent alluded to in Square One. Overrun echoes a lot of the same dejected sentiment as Roses, though in a much more energetic way. It seems as though it's about Spectre leading an attack on a town or city of some sort, while also potentially trying to justify it to himself. The lines he sings, grabbing their guns, firing all around this ruining, before immediately jumping to, "They've taken everything that's near and dear to me," sounds to me like he's catching himself before thinking, and trying to change focus before possibly facing the reality of what he's doing. Regardless, this song is just really fun to listen to, and makes me wish there were more of these energetic vocal pieces like Harbor and Monolith to a Halcyon in the album. Finally, we come to the last song and chapter of Homeward. Here, once again, we have that motif. This song is what I would call Spectre's theme, and it fits him very well going off what we know of him. This seems like something someone who knew more about music theory could dissect and compare to the character, but unfortunately, I'm not that guy. I wouldn't have chosen to leave off with this track if I was in charge. Like I said, I think an Odyssey would be a great way to cap off the experience. Even though this is a great song, we're 3 tracks past the end of the story, and it kind of just feels like supplemental material at this point. in all, I think Homeward does a fantastic job at taking you on a spacefaring journey with or without context. The one you get if you neglect the fanfic may be different than the intended experience, but it's still a great one nonetheless, and I still came away from it feeling like I understood all of the emotional beats and significant events. The flow and following of the story from song to song isn't exactly perfect, but when we zoom out and take the album as a whole, like I said, the broad strokes are all there, and we get a lot of effective vignettes of moments in the story. I'll say, if you can stomach reading an MLP fanfic, it's a great companion piece to Homeward, and even enhance the experience in some parts. While reading the fanfic for this video, one thing I became acutely aware of is that a mediocre or silly story can be significantly uplifted by a good soundtrack. I find myself thinking about video games that flopped on the basis of being generic, potentially being given a fighting chance with a unique soundtrack. Like how Metal Gear Revengeance isn't just a shallow beat-em-up due to its memorable soundtrack. And lastly, I'm sure somebody more versed in music could spend the entire time of this video just analyzing a single song, but I'm pretty passionate about Vylet's music, so I figured I'd give it a go anyway. And I think it turned out alright, all things considered. Maybe I'll end up doing a Mystic Acoustics retrospective as well sometime. If for whatever reason you're still watching, one, thanks, and two, if for some reason you watched through this and haven't listened to the rest of Vylet Pony's discography, you should definitely go do that because there's some amazing songs in there. Check out Mystic Acoustics or Fairy Tales if you want something similar to this. Love Letters Colorless if you want to be sad, and Cutie Marks if you're gay. But seriously, it's a really great album, and it got a not insignificant amount of attention for a Pony album. Major thanks to Vylet for continuing to make music this whole time. They're definitely my favorite musician at the moment, and I hope everything works out for them. As for this video though, we're finished. Thank you and goodbye.